The words sliced through the meeting room like a cold northern wind. We need stronger leadership. I sat at the far end of the mahogany table, my black coffee untouched as the chairman's voice drifted across the glass walls. 21 years, that's how long I'd been with Halden Transport Solutions. 21 years building their logistics empire from scratch, guiding them through the oil crash in 2015, and holding the company together during the pandemic in 2020 without letting go of a single driver. My name is Daniel Cross. I'm 55 years old, or at least I was Senior Vice President of Operations for the largest freight company in Alberta until that morning. We're bringing in someone with a fresh outlook, the chairman continued, refusing to meet my eyes. Someone who understands modern business strategies. I already knew who that someone was, Ethan Miller, 36. Married to the CEO's eldest daughter, his experience, a short stint in digital marketing and a year managing an influencer agency in Toronto. No background in freight, oil, or heavy industrial logistics. But I'd heard the rumors for months. Family barbecues where real decisions were whispered over beers. Golf trips where company futures were casually traded between holes. I folded my hands, feeling the calluses along my knuckles. There was no point arguing, no point listing the contracts I had negotiated or the crisis shipments I had personally driven overnight to save million-dollar deals. Their minds were made up long before today. Daniel, your dedication has been appreciated, said Nathan Cole, the CEO, finally looking up from his leather folder. His voice was smooth, like a lawyer delivering a practiced line. Appreciated. 21 years reduced to a single, dismissive word. The meeting dragged on for another 15 minutes as they detailed transition plans, Ethan's onboarding timeline, and the farewell lunch they'd host for me next Friday. I barely heard them, my mind was already somewhere else. In my blazer pocket, I felt the stiff edge of a business card I'd carried for 4 months, a name that might just change everything. As they dismissed me, I stood up, adjusted my tie, and nodded politely. On my way out, I glanced back at the men sitting around that table, men who would never understand what it took to build trust with roughneck drivers hauling dangerous loads across frozen highways. I closed the door gently behind me. If you want more true stories of hidden resilience, betrayal, and ultimate rise, like this video, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support keeps these powerful stories alive. I walked out of that boardroom with my heart pounding against my ribs. Each step down the quiet hallway felt heavier than the last. As I passed framed photos of Halden Transport's fleet and milestone contracts, memories flooded in like a silent tide I couldn't hold back. I remembered the winter of 2016, when a blizzard shut down every major route in northern Alberta. Dispatch had panicked, drivers were stranded, and clients threatened legal action for breach of contract. But I didn't flinch. I spent 3 straight days rerouting tankers and arranging emergency diesel shipments so crews wouldn't freeze overnight. By the end of that storm, we hadn't lost a single contract. In fact, we gained 2 new ones because word spread that Halden could deliver when no one else could. I thought loyalty meant something. I thought sacrifices were remembered. Missing family dinners, sleeping under my desk during system outages. Personally training every new operations manager to understand that logistics isn't just numbers on a screen, it's the pulse of an entire province. But today, as I walked back to my office, it felt like all of that had vanished into thin air. Like 21 years had been written on a foggy window, and someone just wiped it away with their sleeve. I sat down behind my desk, the old leather chair sighing under my weight. Outside, the Edmonton skyline was glazed in pale morning sun, the same view I'd looked at since 2002, when Halden was nothing but a mid-sized transport contractor fighting for a place among giants. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the cold coffee cup I'd left behind that morning. For a moment, I felt anger rise up in my chest, hot and bitter, but it faded just as quickly, leaving behind a hollow ache I couldn't quite name. In my pocket, the business card pressed against my thigh like a quiet reminder. A reminder that while they saw me as obsolete, someone else saw value in what I had built. Someone who understood that trust and reputation were earned on icy roads and diesel-stained docks, not over cocktails at the CEO's daughter's wedding. And as I took a deep breath, letting it fill my lungs with a calm resolve, I knew this story wasn't over yet. That afternoon drifted by like a silent snowfall, each hour settling gently on my shoulders. I packed my belongings with deliberate care, the framed photo of my daughter Emma from her college graduation, the carved walnut pen holder she made in 9th grade, the small iron sculpture of a truck my drivers gave me one Christmas. Each item told a story of moments that mattered, even if the board no longer did. As I wrapped the photo in newspaper, my phone buzzed softly on the desk. The screen lit up with Emma's name. How did the board meeting go, Dad? My chest tightened. I sat there staring at her words. For a moment, I imagined telling her everything, how they dismissed 2 decades of devotion with rehearsed platitudes, how they replaced me with a man who'd never once driven the Yellowhead Highway in January. But I couldn't bring myself to write that, not yet. Big changes coming, I typed back, forcing my fingers to stay steady. She replied with a heart emoji and I love you. I stared at her message until my eyes blurred with the sting of exhaustion. She had always believed in me, even when I doubted myself, even when I worked 16-hour days and missed her high school hockey finals. She never once threw my absences back at me. She just waited patiently for her dad to come home. I set the phone down and exhaled, feeling the weight of years settle deeper into my bones. Outside, a cold wind rattled the window panes. The sky had turned a flat gray, mirroring the emptiness inside me. I looked around the office that had been my second home for so long, the filing cabinets stuffed with route maps, the shelves lined with safety awards, the faint scent of coffee and diesel oil clinging to my old fleece jacket on the coat hook. Then my gaze fell to my blazer draped over the chair back. The edge of that business card peeked out from its inside pocket, sharp and white against dark wool. I reached for it slowly, feeling the embossed letters under my thumb. Lana Whitaker, Director of Logistics Partnerships, Northern Star Energy. She had given it to me after a negotiation last summer, saying quietly, "If you ever find yourself reconsidering your options, Daniel, call me." At the time, I thought it was just courtesy. Now it felt like something else entirely. That evening, as twilight dimmed the office windows to mirrored glass, I sat alone at my desk with only the low hum of the cleaning crew in the hallways. I turned Lana Whitaker's business card over in my hands, the thick matte paper catching the last traces of light. Her words echoed softly in my memory, "If you ever find yourself reconsidering your options." I tucked the card back into my wallet and stood, stretching my aching back. The floor creaked under my boots as I walked to the window, gazing out over Edmonton's frozen skyline. Streetlights flickered on one by one, lining the avenues like silent sentinels in the deepening dusk. In the distance, trucks crawled along the ring road, headlights piercing through drifting snow. I imagined my drivers out there tonight, their tires humming across icy asphalt, radios crackling with dispatch calls, each one trusting that routes would be clear and fuel cards loaded because Daniel Cross never missed a detail. Because I never let them down, a knock at the door broke the quiet. It was Malcolm, my lead dispatcher, stocky, bearded, always smelling faintly of pine tar soap. "Hey, Dan," he said gently, stepping into the office. "Heard the news." "Damn shame." I nodded, swallowing back the tightness in my throat. "Thanks, Mal, means a lot." He lingered, rubbing his palms together, eyes darting to the boxes on my desk. "Place won't be the same without you. Driver's already talking about it downstairs." I forced a small smile. "They'll manage." "Yeah," he sighed, "but will you?" His question sat heavy between us. I didn't answer. I couldn't. He gave me a quiet nod and left, his boots echoing down the corridor until the sound faded into the whir of distant vacuum cleaners. Alone again, I let my shoulders sag. The office felt colder now, emptier. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 7:13 p.m. Emma would be home from her shift at the urgent care clinic by now, microwaving leftover lasagna, waiting for me to call. I grabbed my coat and switched off the lamp, pausing by the doorway to look back one last time. The room seemed smaller than it had that morning. Or maybe I just felt larger somehow, like something inside me had stretched beyond these walls, past titles and dismissal meetings and farewell cakes. As I walked out into the winter night, Lana's card burned like a quiet promise in my pocket. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale gray light, seeping through my bedroom blinds before dawn. I woke before my alarm, staring at the ceiling as shadows slowly shifted across the room. For a moment, I lay there listening to the quiet hum of the furnace, the ticking of Emma's childhood clock on my dresser, the faint creak of pipes warming in the walls. By 6 o'clock, I was already showered and dressed, black coffee steaming in my travel mug as I pulled into Halden Transport's lot. The building loomed dark and silent, only a few early drivers gathering near the dispatch entrance. I parked in my usual spot, third from the left, beside the salted walkway, and sat with the engine running, heater humming against the cold. I watched the sunrise spill across Edmonton's skyline in streaks of gold and coral, illuminating the frost on my windshield like tiny diamonds. For 18 winters, I had watched that same dawn from this lot. Back when the company was just a regional player fighting for oilfield contracts, when our trucks were second-hand Kenworths with cracked dashboards and heaters that barely worked north of Red Deer. I remembered those years vividly, sleeping 3 hours a night during the Fort McMurray wildfire evacuations, routing emergency convoys for trapped families. hauling freshwater tankers to flooded reserves when roads were half washed away. Earning every contract handshake with quiet promises I never broke. Back then, Nathan Cole shook my hand after the Clearwater mining deal and said, "Daniel, you just put us on the map." I ran my thumb along the steering wheel's worn leather grip, breathing in the scent of diesel drifting from the garages. It mixed with stale coffee and pine air freshener, a smell that had become the scent of my life. Outside, drivers loaded gear bags into their cabs, slapping each other on the back, laughing under frosty breaths. I wondered if Ethan Miller was awake yet, if he was driving in this morning with his city haircut and tailored coat, thinking about quarterly margins and market positioning. If he had any idea that what he was inheriting wasn't just roots and assets, but an unspoken promise between a company and its people. I turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment longer, feeling the business card in my wallet press against my side like an ember still glowing in the ash. Then I opened the door and stepped out into the biting wind, ready to face whatever came next. Later that morning, after hours spent quietly packing up my office, I found myself sitting behind my desk, staring at the black landline phone as if it might ring and undo everything. A faint hum from the fluorescent lights above buzzed in my ears, mingling with the ticking wall clock counting down my final hours at Halden Transport. My eyes drifted to the corner of the desk, where Emma's graduation photo leaned against a stack of route manuals. Her bright smile in that navy blue cap and gown never failed to soften something in me. I remembered how proud she was that day, introducing me to her classmates as my dad, the logistics guy who makes Alberta run. Her quiet pride had always been enough for me, even when the world barely noticed my name. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in deeply, the smell of stale coffee and printer toner grounding me in this room I had called home for so many years. Then with a slow exhale, I reached into my wallet and pulled out Lana Whitaker's business card. The embossed letters glowed in the morning light seeping through the blinds. Director of Logistics Partnerships, Northern Star Energy. I traced each letter with my thumb, feeling the paper's heavy texture, remembering the firmness in her handshake, the calm conviction in her eyes when she said, "If you ever reconsider your options." My fingers hovered over the keypad, heart beating a little faster with each passing second. I wasn't ready to call, not yet, but knowing I could, knowing there was someone out there who saw value in what I built, gave me a small flicker of warmth against the cold ache in my chest. A knock on the door snapped me back. Ethan Miller walked in, his tailored suit crisp, hair styled with precision. He offered me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Morning, Daniel," he said, glancing around at the half-packed boxes, "just checking in on the transition schedule." I nodded slowly, placing Lana's card back into my wallet before he could see. "It's all on your desk," I said quietly. "Route specs, driver assignments, client contacts." "Great," he replied with a dismissive nod, already glancing at his phone. "Let's make this as smooth as possible." He turned to leave without another word. As the door clicked shut behind him, the silence left in his wake felt heavier than before. But deep inside, beneath the bitterness, I felt something stir. Not anger, not fear, but a quiet certainty that my story wasn't ending here. The day passed in quiet fragments of routine, each task carrying a sense of finality. By late afternoon, the winter sun had dipped low behind the office towers, casting long amber beams through the glass walls of my office. I sat at my desk, rolling a pen between my fingers, listening to the muffled sounds of dispatch radios crackling in the hallway. It was almost 5 when my phone buzzed softly beside the coffee mug. I glanced down, unknown number. For a second I hesitated before answering, Daniel Cross. A familiar voice came through, calm and confident. "Daniel, it's Lana Whitaker." I straightened in my chair, heart thudding against my ribs. "Lana, good to hear from you." "I heard about the changes at Halden," she said, her voice tinged with quiet sympathy. "I'm sorry, you deserved better." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "Thank you," I said, swallowing down the tightness in my throat. There was a short pause on the line, the kind that carried weight without needing words. The next evening, as the winter sky deepened into indigo over Edmonton, I pulled into the parking lot of a small steakhouse on Jasper Avenue. Its windows glowed with golden warmth, standing out against the cold sidewalks dusted with fresh snow. I sat in my truck for a moment, staring at my reflection in the darkened window, a lined face, tired eyes, silver hair brushed back neatly. Beneath the fatigue, there was something steadier too, a quiet anticipation I hadn't felt in years. Inside, Lana was already waiting in a corner booth, her tablet and leather portfolio laid out beside a glass of water. She stood when she saw me, offering a firm handshake and a genuine smile that reached her calm gray eyes. "Daniel, thanks for coming. Wouldn't miss it, I replied, shrugging off my coat and sliding into the booth opposite her. After brief small talk about the bitter temperatures and Edmonton's endless road closures, she opened her portfolio and turned the screen toward me. A clean, well-structured logistics proposal appeared, with Northern Star Energy's dark green logo in the corner. We're finalizing our inland expansion, she said, tapping a chart on the screen. Pipeline growth projections are strong. We need someone to build the heavy transport division from the ground up. Routes, driver recruitment, safety protocols, client contracts, all of it. I studied the numbers. They were ambitious but realistic, built on solid assumptions rather than marketing fluff. The projected first-year revenue alone exceeded what Halden Transport had cleared in its first 5 years of operations. Lana leaned back slightly, her eyes never leaving mine. We don't need a brand ambassador, Daniel. We need someone who understands drivers, mechanics, dispatchers, compliance officers, the people who actually keep this province moving. I let out a quiet laugh under my breath, shaking my head. That's what I've spent my life doing. That's why I called you. She paused, letting the words settle between us. Waitresses moved around the dining room, carrying plates of ribeye and steaming baked potatoes to nearby tables. A murmur of conversation and clinking cutlery filled the space, but at our booth, the world felt still. There's equity in this offer, Lana continued, tapping another document. A significant stake. We want someone who thinks like an owner because that's what you'll be. I felt something shift inside me, a sense of possibility cracking open after weeks of numb exhaustion. For the first time since that boardroom meeting, I could see beyond tomorrow morning. I closed the folder and met her steady gaze. What's your timeline? 2 weeks, she said, but if you decide sooner, we can start building sooner. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, frost blooming across the glass. I felt its chill deep in my bones, but beneath it there was a warmth rising too, the quiet heat of resolve. The days that followed moved with a deliberate calm. Each morning I woke before sunrise, making coffee in the silent kitchen while Emma slept down the hall, her nursing textbook spread across the dining table from late-night studying. As the dark hours eased into pale dawn, I sat by the window with my mug, staring at the city lights flickering against the thinning night. I spent Wednesday and Thursday quietly at home, reviewing the proposal Lana had given me. Her offer wasn't just a job, it was a chance to build something with my own hands again. Every line item, every projection, every route map stirred a familiar spark in me. I found myself scribbling notes in the margins, ideas pouring out faster than I could organize them. Suggested truck specs for winter operations, potential subcontractor partnerships, hazard mitigation strategies for northern routes. In between, I answered Emma's casual questions about dinner plans and her upcoming rotation, keeping my decision close to my chest for now. She sensed something different in me, though. That night, as we cleared dishes after dinner, she leaned against the counter and watched me for a moment. "You seem lighter, Dad," she said softly. I paused, drying a plate, then smiled at her. "Maybe I am," I replied, placing the dish carefully into the cabinet. Thursday evening, as Edmonton streets glazed with ice under yellow sodium lights, my phone buzzed with a call from Halden Transport's main number. I stared at it for a few rings before answering. Daniel Cross. "Hi Daniel, this is Colleen from Mr. Cole's office," said the receptionist, her voice polite but taut. "He would like to schedule a meeting with you tomorrow morning to discuss client transition plans. Would 9 a.m. work?" For a moment, I let the silence stretch between us. I could almost hear the nervous rustle of papers on her desk. "Tell Mr. Cole," I said calmly, "that I am no longer available for transition planning. My employment with Halden Transport ended last week." He mentioned this would be a paid consultation. "There's no misunderstanding, Colleen. Tell him I wish him well." I ended the call gently, placing the phone face down on the table. Outside, freezing rain pattered against the window. For the first time in years, I felt no pull to fix their crisis, no obligation to guide them through chaos of their own making. Instead, I turned back to my notes for Lana, pen in hand, as warmth spread through my chest like dawn breaking over a silent, frost-covered highway. Friday dawned gray and silent, low clouds hanging over Edmonton like a heavy wool blanket. I woke before my alarm, a sense of quiet certainty already settled deep in my chest. By 7 a.m. I was showered, dressed, and sipping hot black coffee by the living room window, watching headlights blur past on wet streets below. At 8:30, as I reviewed my notes for Northern Star Energy, my phone buzzed with a message. I picked it up, expecting Emma or Lana, but the sender was an unknown number. "Daniel, this is Ethan Miller. We need to talk." Call me immediately. I stared at the words, letting them settle without reaction. Outside, sleet tapped against the window, each drop trailing down in silver threads. Without replying, I placed the phone face down on the table and returned to my notes, drawing small route schematics in the margins. By mid-morning, I was sitting across from Lana in Northern Star's downtown office, the quiet hum of HVAC ducts and soft clicking of keyboards filling the open workspace around us. She slid a newspaper across the table toward me. Thought you'd want to see this. I glanced down at the front page of the Edmonton Business Journal. The headline read, Halden Transport loses major contract. Shares drop 18%. The article was short but direct. Northern Star Energy had announced its logistics partnership realignment, terminating its long-standing contract with Halden Transport in favor of a new service provider. My eyes lingered on the line stating Ethan Miller declined to comment. How did the press find out so quickly? I asked quietly. We're publicly traded, Lana replied, her expression calm. We're required to disclose material contract changes within 24 hours. I nodded, folding the paper and placing it neatly beside my coffee. A faint, almost imperceptible warmth flickered in my chest, not triumph. Not revenge, just the quiet affirmation that consequences always find their way home. Lana leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. Their loss is our gain, Daniel, but this is only the beginning. We're onboarding 2 other major accounts next month, and I want you leading the entire transition. I met her gaze steadily, feeling the steady rhythm of my pulse anchor me to this moment. Then let's get started, I said, my voice calm but edged with purpose. Outside the window, sleet turned to gentle snow, drifting past glass towers and streetlights flickering on in the early dusk. As I gathered my notes and rose from the table, I felt lighter than I had in years, as if every mile of black highway I'd ever driven was unfolding before me again, wide open and waiting. The weekend moved slowly, each hour carrying a quiet sense of inevitability. I spent Saturday reviewing fleet specifications for Northern Star's proposed contracts, pencil scratching softly across lined paper as snow fell in thick, silent drifts outside my window. Emma came home late from her shift at the clinic, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and kissed me on the temple before heading straight to bed. Sunday morning, I woke before dawn. The city was still, blanketed in unbroken white, streetlights casting long orange shadows across empty roads. I brewed coffee in the dark kitchen, feeling the warmth seep into my chest with each careful sip. By Monday, I was back downtown, walking through Northern Star's glass lobby with its polished concrete floors and brushed steel railings. My boots left faint tracks of melting snow as I moved toward the elevators. In my chest, there was no hesitation now, only a quiet readiness for what lay ahead. Victoria Lang, the vice president of operations, greeted me with a firm handshake outside her office. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek twist, eyes sharp but kind. Welcome aboard, Daniel, she said. Lana S. told me a lot about your approach. We're glad to have you. I nodded, feeling a calm determination settle deeper into my bones. Thank you, let's get to work. She smiled faintly, gesturing toward the large windows framing the skyline. The logistics division is yours to build. Routes, staffing, vendor partnerships, all of it. We trust your judgment. I stepped into my new office as she left, closing the door softly behind me. For a moment, I stood in silence, letting the hum of distant HVAC units and muted voices in the hallway fade into a background lull. The room smelled faintly of new carpet and fresh paint. My reflection in the dark window showed the same lined face and silver hair, but my eyes were steady, focused. I placed my leather-bound notebook on the desk, its pages filled with route maps, cost analyses, and scribbled notes. Sitting down, I opened to a blank page and wrote at the top in clean, deliberate letters, Northern Star Energy, Inland Logistics Operations. Laid, Daniel Cross. Outside, the sun had begun to rise, turning the eastern sky a pale amber behind drifting snowflakes. I watched as trucks moved along the ring road far below, their headlights bright in the early dawn, each one carrying its small promise of purpose through the winter dark. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the quiet certainty that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The days that followed settled into a quiet, purposeful rhythm. Each morning I arrived at Northern Star's offices before sunrise, the hallways still dim and silent, my footsteps echoing against polished concrete floors. I brewed strong coffee in the staff kitchen, inhaling its sharp warmth as I reviewed fleet rosters and vendor contracts in the early hush. By midweek, our transition plan was fully underway. Lana and Victoria worked alongside me, meeting with procurement teams and legal advisors, ensuring every detail was accounted for before we publicly announced the Inland Logistics Division's launch. There was an unspoken current of urgency in each conversation, a readiness to move that reminded me of my early years at Halden Transport, back when growth was driven by grit rather than shareholder optics. Late Thursday afternoon, as I finalized a driver onboarding schedule, my phone buzzed against the desk. I glanced down to see Ethan Miller's name flashing across the screen again. I let it ring. A few minutes later, it buzzed once more, this time a voicemail. I pressed play, listening to his voice tight with barely concealed panic. "Daniel, it's Ethan. Look, we need to talk. Petrox pulled out last week, and now Morrison Chemicals is threatening to follow. I could really use your insight here. Call me." I placed the phone down without responding, feeling a stillness settle over me like a gentle snowfall. For years, I had been the one they called in crises, the silent force that kept operations from fracturing under pressure. But now, the urgency in Ethan's voice felt distant, like a memory that no longer carried weight. That evening, as the city fell into its quiet winter dusk, I walked down to the loading docks behind Northern Star's facility. The air was crisp and sharp with diesel and melting salt. Semi-trucks lined the bays, their trailers lit under bright security lamps, drivers talking quietly in small groups, stamping their boots against the cold. One of the drivers, a stocky man with a salt and pepper beard, caught my eye and nodded respectfully. I nodded back, feeling a small flicker of warmth in my chest. These were my people, the men and women who understood that logistics wasn't about quarterly projections or PR statements. It was about showing up day after day through snowstorms, black ice, and blistering heat to deliver what others counted on. As I walked back toward the offices, Lana stepped out to meet me, her breath curling in pale clouds. "Morrison Chemicals confirmed their switch this afternoon," she said quietly. "They want your team handling their routes by the end of the month." I met her eyes, feeling the steady pulse of resolve behind my ribs. "Then let's make sure we're ready." Snow fell in light flurries as we stood there in the quiet, the faint hum of idling trucks surrounding us. For the first time in years, I felt not just useful, but needed, in a place where experience wasn't something to be replaced, but something to build upon. By the end of that week, the quiet rumblings of change had become an undeniable force across Alberta's logistics industry. Each morning brought new updates to my inbox. Signed transition agreements, confirmed driver transfers, onboarding schedules finalized ahead of target. On Friday, as dawnlight spilled pale gold across the frozen city, I stood by the large glass window in my office, sipping black coffee and reviewing route integration plans. Snow fell in slow, drifting sheets outside, each flake catching in the streetlights before melting against the warm pavement below. The phone on my desk buzzed again. I glanced down, expecting a message from Lana or Victoria. Instead, it was an email alert from Edmonton Business Journal. "Halden Transport seeks emergency funding after major client departures." I opened the article, reading each line with calm clarity. Morrison Chemicals and Petrox Industries had terminated their contracts within days of each other, followed swiftly by Gulf States Energy. Combined, these accounted for nearly 70% of Halden's core revenue. The board had called an emergency meeting to negotiate a bridge loan from private equity investors just to maintain payroll and fleet operations through winter. My eyes lingered on one short line near the bottom. Senior VP of Operations Ethan Miller resigned Thursday, citing personal reasons. I set my coffee cup down gently, listening to the quiet tick of the clock above the door. The emptiness I thought I'd feel wasn't there. Instead, there was only a deep, still acceptance, like watching the final snow settle on an old, abandoned road. Later that afternoon, Victoria knocked softly on my open door, holding a folded newspaper. She placed it on my desk with a faint smile. "You'll want to read the business section," she said, her voice calm and steady. I unfolded the paper to see a small headline at the bottom corner. "Ethan Miller joins family real estate firm after Halden Transport exit." For a moment, I pictured him in some bright, carpeted showroom, explaining mortgage rates and commercial lease options to nervous young couples. Then I closed the paper and set it aside, my attention already returning to the spreadsheets open on my laptop. Outside, drivers were pulling rigs into dock bays, their engines humming low, headlights glowing softly through drifting flurries. I watched them move with practiced precision, each step purposeful and sure, and felt. She smiled, nodding before slipping out to prepare the announcement briefing. I leaned back in my chair, staring for a moment at the small plaque on my desk, "Daniel Cross, Director of Inland Logistics Operations." The title mattered less than what it represented, not authority but trust, not status but purpose. Outside, the sun rose higher, scattering pale gold across the silent city towers. Drivers checked tire chains in the parking lot below, their movements deliberate and focused. Watching them, I felt that same quiet pride I'd carried for decades, knowing that for all the talk of modernization and fresh perspectives, there would always be room in this world for those who showed up early, worked late, and carried their promises like freight that could never be dropped. 6 months later, summer settled over Edmonton in heavy golden waves, the air warm with cut grass and distant diesel drifting from freight yards. That morning, I drove down Jasper Avenue with the window cracked open, warm breeze ruffling my silver hair as sunlight danced across glass towers rising into the bright blue sky. As traffic slowed near 109th Street, my eyes caught on a familiar building, Halden Transport's former headquarters. The large sign that once bore their logo had been removed, replaced by a stark white "For Lease" banner fluttering gently in the breeze. The tall windows, once glowing with early morning office lights, stood dark and empty now. I slowed at the intersection, watching for a long moment. Their operations had relocated to a smaller industrial park on the south side months ago, focusing only on subcontract delivery routes now. I'd heard from drivers that Jacob Miller, a sharp young dispatcher I once trained, had stepped in as operations manager, trying to rebuild what was left. As the light turned green, I pressed the accelerator and continued down the avenue, leaving the empty glass building behind me. That chapter felt closed, not with bitterness, but with a quiet, settled acceptance. I pulled into a small cafe near Northern Star's downtown offices, ordering a black coffee and sitting by the tall window. Outside, Edmonton moved with summer energy, cyclists weaving between cars, delivery trucks idling as drivers unloaded pallets onto metal ramps, pedestrians stepping briskly across sunlit crosswalks. My phone buzzed gently on the table. Emma again, saw the Global Energy report this morning. Northern Star's inland division is leading Western Canada in route reliability. That's you, Dad. I'm so proud. I smiled, feeling the quiet heat of pride settle deep in my chest. The article she mentioned highlighted our expansion into Texas, Montana, and Idaho, with route coverage that had doubled Northern Star's inland revenue. My equity stake, once a hopeful projection scribbled in Lana's first proposal, now exceeded what I had earned in 20 years at Halden. But more than the numbers, it was the mornings like this that mattered most. Sitting here with hot coffee in my hands, knowing that every driver clocking in under my watch felt respected and protected, knowing that every vendor or client call was met with quiet confidence and follow-through. Finishing my coffee, I stood and walked the short block to Northern Star's offices, the glass doors reflecting bright summer light as I entered. Inside, the lobby hummed with muted conversations and the rhythmic tap of reception keyboards. Victoria stood by the elevators reviewing a printed proposal, her eyes lighting up when she saw me. "Morning, Daniel," she said with a small nod. "Ready for today's strategy session?" "Always," I replied, stepping in beside her as the elevator doors slid open. As we rose past each sunlit floor, I felt the calm anticipation I'd carried my entire career, the quiet certainty that no matter how industries changed or who sat at the boardroom table, there would always be work worth doing. Always routes to build, promises to keep, and people to guide safely home. And for Daniel Cross, that was enough. If there's one truth I've learned through these months of upheaval, it's this. Your worth is never tied to a single company, title, or office door. For 21 years, I thought loyalty alone was enough to keep my place. But what truly mattered wasn't the logo on my pay stub. It was the integrity I carried into every conversation, the promises I kept at 3A. On frozen highways, and the quiet respect built over decades of showing up when others couldn't. We live in a world that worships fresh perspectives and shiny credentials, but don't ever let that blind you to the enduring power of experience, grit, and kindness. Companies will rise and fall, new managers will come and go, but your word, your consistency, and your relationships, those remain your real legacy. If you're sitting at your kitchen table right now wondering if your best years are behind you, hear this from me. They're not. Sometimes it takes losing what you thought defined you